Hello, I'm Nick Clark. This is Counter the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, the world is drowning in a record amount of debt. The UN warns the crushing crisis is most prevalent in poor developing nations. Also this week, Africa spends more money on servicing debt than on education or healthcare as leaders demand a reform of the global financial system. Plus, on the brink of default, the list of nations seeking debt restructuring is growing. Who's to blame for the delay in relief? So global debt has hit a record $307 trillion in 2023, and that includes the amount of money owed by corporations, governments, and individuals right around the world. And it is equivalent to almost $40,000 for every single person on the planet. Multiple crises in recent years has worsened the problem, pushing countries to the brink. And that simply means some of the poorest countries in the world are servicing their debts instead of providing for their people.
Some 3.3 billion people, almost half of humanity, live in countries that spend more on debt interest payments than on education or health. And yet, because most of these unsustainable debts are concentrated in poor countries, they are not judged to pose a systemic risk to the global financial system. This is a mirage. 3.3 billion people is more than a systemic risk. It's a systemic failure.
Antonio Guterres, well, the COVID-19 pandemic, the cost of living crisis, climate change, and the impact of natural disasters have all contributed to the surge in government borrowing. Indeed, a report by the UN Global Crisis Response Group says that worldwide public debt reached $92 trillion last year. That's more than a five-fold increase since the year 2000. As a result, borrowing has outpaced global GDP growth, which tripled over the same time. Most of the public debt crisis is concentrated in developing countries. In the past decade, there's been an increase in the number of countries facing high levels of debt from 22 nations to 59 last year. Of these 52 nations, almost 40% of the developing world are in serious debt trouble, according to the International Monetary Fund. Countries like Sri Lanka, Ghana, Ethiopia, and Pakistan have already defaulted or are likely to do so. Well, countries mainly borrow from the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, and they repay the money with interest. And when they can't, they risk being cut off from credit by international financial institutions or private investors. And to borrow again, they have to agree to a deal to restructure their debt and limit spending, and that's often led to social unrest. For example, in 2010, Greece's IMF bailout plan that included austerity measures was met with massive protests. All right, let's take this on. From London, joining me is Greg Swenson. Greg is the founding partner at a merchant bank at Brink. Greg, welcome to Counting the Cost. So first up, why has the world reached this record amount of debt?
Nick, there's probably a bunch of contributing reasons, but I think the most obvious is just in the last few years, where you've had two major issues. One is you had really reckless spending during and after the pandemic, even after many economies had recovered, and they continued, especially here in the U.S. and the U.K., they continued with really exorbitant spending, and that's created so much excess debt from deficit spending. The second issue, especially in the U.S., but even here in the U.K., you have some excessive spending on green energy projects, which don't actually contribute to productivity in the country. All it does is add debt to the balance sheet without contributing or creating more products for people to spend, so it's to buy. So it's basically inflationary, but all done with deficit spending. So those are the two major contributors, and now that both developing and developed countries have to figure out how to pay it back.
Right. So obviously a big problem for poor developing nations, but what kind of issues does it create for the richer nations, this kind of debt?
Well, I mean, first of all, the richer nations traditionally have been able to carry debt, especially in the U.S., because it's the reserve currency and you're able to continue with deficit spending and carry account deficits. But the lower lower income or developing countries don't have that luxury. So I think it has to start with the larger economies. It has to start with the U.S. and the U.K. and Western Europe, but it has to ultimately be dependent somewhat on the developing countries as well. So it's got to be both, but it's got to be led with the larger economies.
We heard of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres talking about the risks of unsustainable debt. What kind of risks are there?
Well, yeah, the most obvious is austerity. If they can't service the debt, or if the IMF or World Bank forces these developing countries to cut spending, and these are countries where the people are really dependent on food subsidies or even direct food deliveries. So if you look at countries like, there's 4 in Africa, 4 in Asia. The larger ones in Africa are Nigeria and Kenya. And in Asia, it's the Philippines and Pakistan, high population countries where over 40% of income is spent on food. So if there is austerity, if there is inflation, which is basically a tax on these consumers, and they're already spending a considerable amount of their income on food, that's going to lead to social unrest. We saw that 10 years ago with the Arab Spring in North Africa. We could very well see it again in these countries that are spent, where the consumers, the people, are spending considerable amounts of their income on food. So he's got a point. I think the developing countries, are where the risk really is of social unrest due to austerity on debt service. It won't happen in the larger economies, but it's really a shame because so much of the borrowing has happened in the last few years without any real productive results from that borrowing. And so it's a shame that many people are going to suffer in Asia and Africa, sub-Saharan Africa.
Right. So we have this extraordinary crisis, but is it even manageable?
I think it is. I think ultimately it is. You're going to have some workouts. You're going to have some restructurings. I think what really has to happen, again, beginning with the bigger economies, the larger economies in the West, is cutting spending, and the larger economies can do that. Some of the developing economies have trouble cutting spending because it's food and healthcare and education for their economies. They're much more dependent on government spending. But austerity in the West is different than austerity in the global South. So cut spending in the West. The second is to liberate the supply side. And there's been such hostility to the private sector, which is in effect inflationary and ultimately creates more deficit spending and more overall debt levels. So, the supply side has to be liberated. So we have lower debt, we have lower rates, more products are produced. That brings down inflation. It also creates economic growth, which therefore creates tax receipts or higher tax receipts. So the best way to pay back debt is to liberate the private sector in both developing and developed economies.
Right. Given debt interest payments are often bigger than overall spending on, say, health or education, how feasible is it for lenders to pause debt or even just to write it off?
I think there's going to have to be some write-offs. We saw that in sub-Saharan Africa in the last few years. I think there's going to have to be some restructurings. You see it even in Eastern Europe, in small economies like Montenegro, where you have large borrowings from the Chinese. Those debt service or interest payment holidays are ending. It's going to make it very difficult for smaller economies. So there has to be workouts, that's for sure. But I think we also have to consider, again, in the larger economies, cut back on spending, focus on creating economic growth. That will create more tax receipts.
There's a lot of talk about a reform of the global financial system. Do you think that could happen?
I think ultimately there has to be some reforms around the edges. I don't think there could be some major restructuring of the system. You'll probably see less dependency on the U.S. dollar with oil trading in different currencies. You might see a shift to the global South as population grows in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia and the Middle East, North Africa, with very low population growth in Western Europe as well as in the United States. So, there might be some shifts based on movements of people and different population, different demographics. I think you also have to look at China. They have a major property problem. So the sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America are going to be less dependent and have to be less dependent on China because they just don't have the money to continue with the Belt and Road Initiative due to the fact that they've got debt problems at home. So I think that's something we all have to think about.
Right, all interesting stuff, Greg. Appreciate that. Greg Swenson then from Merchant
Thanks,
Bank.
Nick. Good to be here.
Well, of the 52 low and middle income countries dealing with unsustainable debt, 23 are in Africa. Zambia became the first African country to default on its sovereign debt. That was during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. China is a significant creditor to the country's infrastructure projects. Loans with high interest rates have restricted the government's ability to invest in social programs and infrastructure development. But Zambia has become a test case for potential defaulters. After months of talks, its lenders, including China and the Paris Club, agreed to restructure $6.3 billion of Zambia's loans in June. The southern African country will pay about $750 million in the next decade. That is instead of almost $6 billion that was due before the debt restructuring. The nation has been negotiating similar deals with private creditors. A UN report says, on average, African nations borrow at a cost 4 times higher than that for the United States and 8 times higher than that for the wealthiest European economies. Well, from Ghana's capital, Accra, I'm joined now by Daniel Anim. He's the lead consultant at Nene Bank's management and the chief economist at the Policy Initiative for Economic Development in Africa. Daniel, welcome. So first up, why are African countries trapped in this vicious cycle of debt?
Thank you very much indeed. We're trapping in the kind of debt network is predominantly because of our historical antecedent, which is our economics were structured to be exportation of raw materials. We've never added values to the raw materials that we have. So anytime there's a global economic phenomenon, the shock in terms of the risks associated to our economics has been very high. So we developed or we modeled the economy in such a way that we export more raw materials and we depend largely on debt. Over the period, no African country deliberately have put in place a mechanism to save and invest towards infrastructure development. So anytime we have to develop the economy, we have to resort to debt. So that's the model that we've been running over the period. And that's the reason which it appears that we do not have any buffer in terms of liquidity, savings to be able to execute our own infrastructure development. And more importantly, because there was no deliberate mechanism in terms of savings, as and when there's a need for capital injection into the various economies on the continent, then we resort to borrowing. And we are not in a better position to negotiate for a better terms. So
Right.
we go in for debt at a very high cost.
What doesn't help is the high level, the massive levels of interest. I mean, what did we say? It was 4 times higher than that for the United States, and 8 times higher than that for the wealthiest European economies' interest rates. How has that ever come to be?
Yes, it's quite difficult. And just like I indicated, if you do not plan your economy in a manner that on your own, you'll be in a better position to mobilize liquidity for infrastructure development. And as and when you need the capital, the market is able to negotiate better than you do. You are in a very disadvantaged position. And that has been the model for most African economies. Unfortunately, that's the situation. And that's the reason which we go in for the money. And there's another leg to the whole discussion. Mismanagement and corruption on the part of most political leaders on the continent of Africa. So even the money that comes into the economies are not invested into the rest sectors of the economy where it will anchor economic growth. So most of the money goes into consumption, the rest goes into pockets of individual political leaders. And that's the reason which it's becoming very difficult for us to service our debts. So once you need the money and you do not have any plan for it, you are at a disadvantage, and then those who control the capital will negotiate better, and that is what is happening to the continent, and
Right.
that is the reflection of why we are not paying our debts.
So the nations have to service at these massive rates of interest. How does that impact their ability to develop?
Certainly, it's impacting on our development, and that's the reason which the poverty levels is quite high on the continent, because monies that were supposed to develop the rest sectors of the economy to have the ripple effect on the living standard of the citizens are being used to service debts. Social interventions that governments in the various economies are supposed to employ to ensure that they elevate the people from poverty or we minimize the poverty levels. Such monies are being used to service debts. So there's high poverty levels on the continent, lack of infrastructure development that will anchor development, and we have seen a lot of underdevelopment on the various economies. And more importantly, the government inability to deliberately support the private sector to be able to create the necessary jobs and the necessary opportunities for the citizens. So these are the negative or the replications of such a high capital that most African countries have gone for.
Daniel, briefly, what do you make of accusations against China that they're pushing African nations into a debt trap?
Yes, of course. The Chinese have an agenda. The agenda is very simple. They realize that Africa have a very huge natural resource deposit, and because of the quest to develop their economies, they need our resources. They need to fuel industrialization. So the model is let's come to Africa, in a way try to support them and also ensure that we take most of their resources. So if you recall, most of the loans that Chinese give to African countries are collateralized, linked to a particular resource. Here in Ghana, I recall when we were looking for the 3 billion syndicated loan, they wanted our oil, they wanted our cocoa. Same to most of the African countries. I must admit that what China is doing is not new to us. We have had similar model by the West and then the European powers over the period, and China is just replicating the model that have existed over the period. I must admit that as much as China has this deliberate agenda to ensure that we are in debt so that they can take control of the resources on the continent, I will largely blame the political leaders of the continent. Because it appears that we do not have any deliberate strategy in terms of driving our own development agenda. And if you are a nation, you are a continent without a deliberate policy, you would be exploited by those who have the resources and those who have such an agenda.
All right. Daniel, appreciate that. Thanks so much for joining us here on Counting the Costs. It's Daniel Amatai-Anu. Thank you.
Equally grateful.
Now, developing countries owe Chinese lenders more than $1 trillion. That's according to Research Lab aid data. And overdue loan repayments are soaring. China has emerged as the largest global bilateral creditor in the past decade. It is, in fact, catching up with the IMF and the World Bank and is exceeding other governments as an official lender to the developing world. Beijing has replaced Washington in bailing out low and middle income countries. Well, China has lent massive sums to several countries across Asia, Africa and Europe as part of its global infrastructure project, the Belt and Road Initiative. But many nations are struggling to repay and face economic instability and are on the verge of collapse. The US blames Beijing for pushing them to the brink. China puts a responsibility on US-led financial institutions. Well, China has been reluctant to cancel large liabilities owed by countries struggling to make ends meet. Aid data says that 80% of Beijing's lending portfolio in the developing world is now supporting nations in debt distress. China is also dealing with trillions of dollars owed by its own local governments, their financial affiliates, and real estate developers. Well, joining me now in our studios, I'm pleased to say, here in Doha, is Shirley Wu, who's a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics and a senior practitioner fellow with the Ash Center at Harvard Kennedy School. Shirley, welcome. So first up, what do you make of these accusations against China? Are Chinese loans to developing countries a debt trap?
Those statistics you quoted, Nick, are compelling. However, I would say it is a bit misleading to call it a debt trap for what China has done to the developing world. China loans 20% of the debt to African sovereign nations. The other 80% are loans by the multilateral institutions, international financial entities, countries such as the United States, some EU countries, Turkey, India, Japan, etc. So if you call the 20% the China loans to Africa a debt trap, then I wonder what do you make of the other 80% that are collectively loaned by all the other entities to Africa? China is loaning over $1 trillion, as you mentioned, to the developing world, many of them in the far-reaching regions of the world. And many of them are run by illiberal and the non-democratic regimes. And so overnight, political systems could change. We saw a wave of coups in West Africa. We saw political system change in Venezuela. So none of these is an assurance to China in terms of the ownership guarantee or a loan guarantee in terms of protecting China's overseas interests. So it's a major strategic vulnerability for China. But when it comes to the debt relief effort, as you mentioned, since 2021, China relieved the 23 African countries' debt. And in 2022, China has successfully helped Ghana in restructuring its debt.
Do you think that process works? So China is at the forefront of trying to do something about it, you reckon? It's not down to the Western-led institutions to blame?
China is trying to do all what it can, and I should say that is not out of altruism either, because it is indeed in China's interest that these over $140 billion of debt that China loans to Africa does not go into default. However, I don't think we should use a blame game here, because the reality is that Africa, in particular, has been shut out of the global modernity by not being offered sufficient capital funding for the past 4 or 5 centuries. This is the moment where the West and China should join hands in providing massive capital in infrastructure building to the world's least developing nations. No country should be shut out of the world's modernity and economic prosperity for a matter of lack of financing.
Of course, China itself has its own colossal debt problem, doesn't it? So how does it benefit from lending money to other nations at this scale?
So if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, this is the 10th year. So over the past decade, China has really been escalating its both its domestic capabilities as well as its expansion of its investment capacity globally. And so I think the investment within its domestic capacity and its overseas investment capability are coordinated. So at the beginning of the Belt and Road Initiative, China has been building a lot of physical infrastructure, rails, roads, ports, etc. And of course, those are important because without the physical infrastructure, we cannot start to talk about trade, jobs growth, or economic opportunities. And next, China started to build digital infrastructure from submarine cable networks to telecom infrastructure, base stations, clouds, etc. So those are conducive to the rise of the digital economy in these developing countries. And then after COVID, we started to see China moving massively into green energy building, social enterprises, public healthcare building, etc. So a lot of the investment in the public goods area is going to help the developing countries in moving towards environmental sustainability and economic sustainability.
And as far as the overseas loans are concerned, isn't China now shifting to providing emergency rescue loans to countries as opposed to the infrastructure projects that you're talking about?
Absolutely. I think that really goes with the natural development patterns of an ascending global power. If you were to look at the United Kingdom in the 19th century or the United States in the 20th century, all of these rising powers, they started by exporting labor. And then these countries became the exporter of capital, subsequently the exporter of technology, and subsequently the exporter of global rules and norms and values and institutions, what we saw in the expanded BRIC summit back in August. That is the start of China's efforts for the next phase of building multilateral institutions to finance the developing world for the developing world.
Do you think the debt crisis as a whole, both in China and outside China, is manageable, or is it a ticking time bomb?
These are very complicated questions. Domestically speaking, for China, the debt issue is most acute in the corporate sector and in the municipal government sector. So what the government is trying to do is to do stringent due diligence in order to build a firewall to prevent the corporate financial stress from being spilled over to the financial sector in order to prevent a systemic financial crisis. But China does have a lot of levers, both in terms of monetary and fiscal policies in place in the event of a severe economic calamity. And if we were to reflect on the 07-08 US centered global financial crisis, the US has promised 4 rounds of QEs in order to provide a floor of liquidity to the financial system. China hasn't even begun to talk about QEs yet. So I think there are still a lot of policy room available to address some severe cataclysmic events in China.
We'll have to leave it there. Shirley Wu, great to have you in the studio here to talk about all this. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's our show for this week. Do get in touch with us on X, formerly known as Twitter, of course, at Nick Clark Al Jazz. And please do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or just drop us an email. Counter the cost at aljazeera.net is our address. Plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC, and that will take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Nick Clark, and from the whole team here in Doha, thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is coming up.